If I could ask everybody to please give a big round of applause to our next guest, Stefanie Eskander.
She has to turn the lights off so you can see my slides, so if you're in the other room, you have to come in here. I'm really glad that we were able to dim the lights because earlier I was really struggling to see them. And
I'll go tell them. I'll go tell them.
Have a conversation with those people. While we're kind of everybody gathering around, how many of you, this is your first JemCon? Raise your hand if you've never been to a JemCon. And of those of you who have been to JemCon before, how many of you were here in 2018 when I was here for the first and only time? Oh, yay! Awesome. So it's very possible you might sleep through this presentation. There's some similarities. I always try to create fresh graphics when I do a presentation, but I just want to introduce myself. I'm Stefanie Eskander, and I was fortunate enough to have been on the gem design team at Hasbro in 1986 and 1987. And although I wasn't the primary force behind gem, I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Roseanne Radosevich said. If those of you who have heard her words that she sent in, she sent some background into gem, and Roseanne really was the driver behind gem. The concept came into Hasbro, but she made it real. And when I arrived at at Hasbro in 1986, in February of 1986, Roseanne, my brand new boss, was at Toy Fair. And I didn't even get to meet her, but she was at Toy Fair introducing gem, so that was pretty exciting. So I'm going to go through a little bit of history and tell a few little stories, and then we'll do some question and answer, and hopefully I will be able to figure this out. I should be able to just go like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I entered the toy industry formally. I had been freelancing, doing a few toy projects prior to this time, but I entered the full-time world of toys in January of 1985 when I went to work at Mattel. And it was an exciting time at Mattel, and I was in the large and small dolls group. I was lucky enough to be working on Rainbow Bright, Popples. So there, Lady Lovely Locks, and was really pleased with the work that I did, but personal circumstances led us to want to go elsewhere, primarily because we were living in a tiny little cottage in Hollywood, and I just had a baby, and we had 3 kids, and so the East Coast beckoned, and I was offered a position at Hasbro. And so I went to Hasbro, and many of you may not kind of know how it is in the toy industry, but it's very rare when you're a designer that you're only working on one thing at a time. Generally speaking, you're working on multiple projects at a time, and in multiple stages. You might be working on early concept invention work on one thing, and then you might be doing paint masters for a doll line that's going into production. It's just this constant cycle of projects. Sometimes you come into projects late, they've already been started by somebody else, it gets turned over to you. Sometimes you work on the very beginning and then you turn it over to somebody else. There's just lots of ways we work. So when I arrived at Hasbro, the 2 lines that I immediately were put on was Gem and Real Baby. And but I just wanted to kind of show a few of the lines that I worked on at Hasbro. Sweetie Pops, Lullaby Baby, Moon Dreamers, my personal favorite, My Beautiful Doll, Maxie, Dolly Surprise, lots of Dolly Surprises. So, just picture me, brand new at Hasbro, and I walk in and how many of you went to the Hasbro tour? Okay, so The building that we went into was not the building that I started in. The building that had Mr. Potato Head outside, the one-story building, that was where I started my first year. And so all the designers were crammed into that building, and they even had some offices down in the basement. We were all crammed into little cubicles in the basement. So I walked into Hasbro my very first day, and I'm put into kind of some closet. They didn't, Roseanne was off at Toy Fair, and I guess she forgot that I was coming, and so she didn't have an office ready for me. So I'm sitting in a closet, and the very first assignment that I'm given is to design a gem makeup head. Now, this is not my original drawing. I recreated this about a year ago, or less than a year ago. I thought, everybody wants to know what the gem makeup head would have looked like. Who loves makeup heads? They're so fun. Anyway, so I was assigned this gem makeup head, and I, really wanted to prove myself. It was an exciting time. Jen had done well at Toy Fair, and everybody was really pumped. Roseanne had come back by this point, and I think I got out of the closet, but not sure. Anyway, no, I'm not in that closet. Anyway, I came out and I did this beautiful rendering. This is kind of what I was known for, is my ability to draw and to create renderings. So I did this beautiful rendering of Gem, and how she would transform. And I'm trying to imagine in my mind what it would have looked like back then. It could have looked completely different, but this is kind of the gist of it. And so, she had a transformability that she was able to transform her hair as Jerica, mostly blonde, into this pink hair, glamorous. And when she got all of her makeup on, her gem star earrings would light up, and she'd just be fabulous, right? So I go into my very first presentation with all the big wigs. So we go into this room, and I'm back behind it, and people are like, go on, Stefanie, out and show your drawing. So I walk out, and I'm showing it to the executive vice president of marketing. And he took one look at that thing, and he said, next. That makeup head went right out the door, and I don't know where my rendering went, but hopefully not in the trash. But a sad story, isn't it? But anyway, my second assignment was we were planning a Gem World Tour. And so the idea was Gem was going to travel around the world, and everywhere she went, they were going to give her some sort of pet as a souvenir to take home. So I was in a brainstorm with my colleague, and she and I sat around and talked about what are we going to do, what are we going to do. And we came up with the idea that she would have a llama. She'd be going to South America, and so that's where the llama came from. She was in South America. We also toyed with other ideas. One of the ideas was she would go to Australia and she would get a pink koala. I actually created that artwork and the makeup artwork as little postcards too that you can get if you're interested, just as kind of visionary of what we thought. Now the koala didn't get as far as even this kind of sketch, but I thought everybody might want to know, right? You kind of want to know what our hopes and dreams were, even if they were never realized. So that was what we did, and of course I had so much fun designing the llama. And originally she was going to come with a lot more accessories. She was going to come with a bowler hat, because she was, from the Andes, and she was going to come with a little feeding dish that kind of looked like a dog dish. And of course she had to have a hat box that would go on her back and snap around her belly. And then of course the brush and the blanket, which were actually produced. So sadly, because unbeknownst to us, by the time this went into production in early 2017, late 2000, I'm sorry, 1987, I finished it in 1986, and it started, it went through the sculpting process and all the processes. By early 1987, I think the handwriting was on the wall that Gem's sales were not going to be what they were hoping for, and eventually, what happened. This is for Jenny. When I came to JemCon 5 years ago, I was just at the beginning of my journey of discovery of my toy career. before that time, everything had been packed away in boxes and in my memory and not in a computer anywhere. And so as I prepared for JemCon, I started getting things out, and I'm sorry, this is really noisy, but it is what it is. I started going through files, and one of the things that I was thinking about was, as I was trying to create the llama, this was like a new thing. The dolls department this was not the My Little Pony group, and so we weren't used to doing animals. That was something kind of new to the dolls group. And so when I was exploring the way to do that, I didn't want it to be a My Little Pony with fur glued on, because there would be some construction issues with the edges of the plush pulling away and stuff. So I turned to Snuggle Buns, among my favorite cute toys, to see how they were made. And the Snuggle Buns were constructed, they were rotomolded like a doll head or like a My Little Pony, but they had like a ridge that was in their backs. And then what they would do is they would glue the plush in, but the edges of the plush butted up against the ridge, so you couldn't see it or you couldn't access it to tear it off. And I thought that was so clever at the time that I considered, I had a Snuggle Bum in my office, and I considered Snuggle Bums kind of my inspiration for the construction. So that's my little homage to Jenny, because she loves Snuggle Bums. Then my next project was actually, I think that in the past I possibly have taken a little more credit than I should have for some other designs that I did, because as is very common, when you work in a toy company, it's often very collaborative, and it's very rare that a project is entirely one person's. I think that the llama was mine. You know, I did that one from start to finish. But my next projects, which were Synergy, was partly mine. And so I was the designer that did all of the finishing touches on Synergy, gave her accessories, her bodysuit, her face paint, you know, a lot of the last details. I think the basic design of the bodysuit was done by a previous designer, then it was handed off to me, and so I finished her up. And I always considered Synergy my design, but again, I have to give other designers credit for, you know, some preliminary work that they did. After Synergy was done, I was assigned to do the second year holograms, and with one big restriction. Roseanne said that I could not create new patterns, completely new fashions. What I had to do was take the existing fashions and make them fresh. So I bet some of you might not even have realized that they are pretty much the same fashions as the first year holograms, but completely redone with new colors and new textures and new fabrics. When I arrived at Hasbro in 1986, one of the things that I was a little bit surprised about, because I love color. Color is just kind of my thing, and I love bright colors, and I worked on popples, and they were full of color. And when I saw the holograms, my first thought was, they're not very colorful. They need to be really wow. So when I was assigned the girls, I wanted to make sure that they were really wow. And so I think I did. And Walter was kind enough to bring his dolls that he has, the second year holograms. I actually don't own any of them, so just saying. But adding fun fabrics, my experience at Mattel had really taught me a lot about fabrics and what was really available. And I think Hasbro, at that point, this was only really the beginning of the second year of development on Gem, and I think they were still finding their way as far as fabric choices were concerned. They knew all about the metallic tricot and things like that, but you know, working at Mattel, I really became familiar with all of the glitzy Barbie fabrics. And we had a big fabric room that was just full of exciting kinds of glitzy, glimmery, shimmery, glittery fabrics. And so, you know, I went out and was able to source like the cute polka dot fabric on Aja. We pronounced it Asia, by the way, when I was there, not Aja. Because she was Asian, right? So we pronounced it Asia, but Aja. her skirt had the metallic dots, which I thought were really fun and colorful. Black, you know, we didn't see too much black except for the Misfits and later the Sting. Anyway, so I had a lot of fun designing those and trying to make them look different. And of course, the big thing that I pushed for was earrings. We had to have earrings because at that point, only Jem had earrings, and I wanted the holograms to have earrings. So. Yay. And the other thing was that I was not really an experienced face painter at that point. Even in my time at Mattel, I had painted eyes and things, but I hadn't really painted doll faces. And so Roseanne assigned me to do Rhea from the neck up. So I did Rhea's face design. I didn't choose her sculpture, that was already assigned. But this, you know, her face paint, I was so nervous about that because, you know, this was not just painting some eyeshadow on a fashion doll face.
You've said so many interesting things. Every time I hear you, even if it's something similar, like even another pearl of wisdom, so thank you. Your fabric choices were just fabulous, or truly outrageous. Did you have free reign, or did you have a catalog of samples?
No, I had free reign.
That's cool.
And I think because of my Mattel experience, she was a lot more confident because she knew that I'd been exposed to so many more kinds of fabric than I would be just in the Hasbro sample.
First of all, thank you so much, Stephanie, for being here. I have a question that you touched on earlier about being a toy designer in general, and especially with Hasbro. With the learning and development department, and obviously these are discovery play, dolls. What was the process with learning and development team, and maybe some consumer psychologists and early development psychologists that helped with the team to make? I mean, essentially, like Jem and with Hasbro, it's essentially a living embodiment of a transformer. So that's a trope that Hasbro has, obviously, as transformers, and a lot of the toys transform into things and are discoverables. What was the process designing with that L&D team and maybe some developmental psychologists?
So let me paraphrase for the people on Zoom, which was a very complicated thing to paraphrase. But the learning development, the research and development, and the play aspect of it, which you talk about a lot on your Instagram, talk more to the people about that.
That really is probably almost a panel in itself. There's a lot. I mean, we didn't call it learning and development, we call it research and development. And so R&D at Mattel was D&D, design and development. But hand in hand with, our design, it was our responsibility to be aware of what was going on with childhood development and with play pattern. We call it play patterns, how children play. What are the successful elements of a toy, and why do some things work and some things don't? And it was kind of a learning process. When I arrived at Hasbro in 1986, I'd only been designing full-time toys for a year. Fashion dolls skew older, and Jem was no exception. We were not designing Betsy Wetsy here. We were designing a sophisticated doll that coincidentally had a cartoon show that went along with it to help promote. And one of the kind of magical things that Hasbro did, which was really not done before, was they created, Griffin McCall, their ad agency, had Sunbow was their division that created these cartoon series, which were done specifically to promote Hasbro's toys. Not the reverse. Usually the property comes first, then they find an animation company, and the animation company comes in and supports the product. But this time, the animation was done specifically to support the doll sales. And so that was kind of had not really been done before. And of course, they did that with Moon Dreamers and G.I. Joe and other toys. And then even Mattel that had their animation, Filmation was their animation company, and they did He-Man. That company was independent. It was not part of Mattel's. They didn't own it or anything. They just hired Filmation to promote their toys and create their animation series. So it was kind of unusual and kind of groundbreaking at that time. So it was, you know, Hasbro was really kind of on the verge of a lot of sophisticated marketing, but they were growing so quickly. 2 or 3 years before Gem was being developed, Hasbro was not really a doll company at all, and so they learned a lot and made mistakes and did some things right. But you know, the fact that Gem has lived so long in people's memories and has such fond memories is really a tribute to Hasbro's farsightedness, and yet the cancellation of Gem kind of shows their short-sightedness, because I don't think there's anybody here that's glad that Gem ended when it did, right? We could have used another 10 years. Yes. Or more, right?
I'm delighted to say we're back. Say.
So here we are, back in my office, right? So I'm taking these pictures, I'm preparing for JemCon, and I looked at these two particular Polaroid pictures, and I saw on the far left side this llama with a Gem doll sitting on the back. And I said, what is that? Gem, I didn't recognize it. And so I looked at the next slide, and over in the corner of that one, which you can see on the right, the far right, you see a little doll sitting over there on the edge of the shelf. I looked at that and I said, oh my gosh, I remember that green dress that was covered with stars. I had totally forgotten that I had designed a Gem and Jerrica that would have been for, as far as I recall, for the 1988 basic new Gem and Jerrica doll. And this was never photographed. These models were the only ones that I had, and I could barely remember what they looked like. And so, as you know, I fortunately, starting in 1987, unfortunately not starting until 1987, I kept copious notes. I kept a date, a day planner, and notebooks. When I started in toys, I would keep a notebook, and it would be my meeting notes, brainstorm notes, things like that. But my day-to-day calendar, I didn't start keeping until January 1987. But I did have notebooks. So I started searching a little further, because I thought, well, I've got to be able to prove this. I can't just imagine that I designed Gem and Jerrica, because you don't see her anywhere, right? So I went into a little notebook that I was taking notes, and I looked at this. I don't know if you can see it, but this was from a staff meeting dated October of 1986. So we're back in the old building. I'm in a meeting and we're taking notes, and Roseanne is giving us our assignments. So I'm furiously writing down my assignments. The first one is Moon Dreamers, and I say open stock. That means the new line of Moon Dreamers. So I was assigned all the new Moon Dreamers. And then it says Gem Jerrica Redo. And it says plush underneath that. Well, you might think of plush as meaning like plush animals. For the word we used for any soft goods was plush. So that meant that I had to have the fashions designed by, well, I don't think I have a date on that, but it was soon, right? And then there was the Gem Wedding, Kimber and Mail. And it said the plush was to be designed by January. And the PTO, which means the turnover, was going to be in, March of 1987. Did not happen. But I was assigned the bride to the Kimber bride and groom doll as an assignment. And then it goes down, and we have the low-end Moon Dreamers play sets, including the Cosmic Cafe, which some of you might be familiar with, which were the ones that I did. So these were my assignments. So, of course, you know, this was, at this point, 30 plus years earlier in 2018 when I was doing all this work. And so I was getting ready to go to JemCon, so I said, well, I'm just going to create some artwork based on these fuzzy photos and my memory. And so I created, my kind of revised drawings of Jerrica and Gem and what those outfits would have looked like. So That's where that came from. So, but I just did want to say a word about what happened when Jem was canceled, and something that I learned from Walter about that really sad experience, which I didn't find out till well after JemCon in 2018. Jem was canceled, I think the date was in May of 1987, and we all got word that she wasn't going to go forward, and our hearts were broken because we had invested a lot in Jem, and especially Roseanne. That was really her baby, and we worked really hard to bring this vision to life, and even, you know, whatever small part or large part we had in the line, we were really devastated that it happened. And Walter told me a story that a number of years ago, when he was a younger man, but was always fascinated with Jem, he contacted a man named Jim Swearingen, and Jim was a great guy. He was a marketing manager at Hasbro and worked on the Jem line, and we all really liked Jim, and he's still out there. He's retired from the toy industry, but he's a wonderful guy. And Walter was talking to him about what had happened to Jim, and Jim recounted that one day he went into his office, which was in the other building, that low building. He was over there, he walked into his office and all of his Jem stuff was gone. He had his own personal Jem doll, he had, I guess, some other Jem posters and different Jem things, and everything was gone. And he found out that they had done a purge. Everything that people had in their office that was Jem was taken in the dark of night. And after I heard this story, I thought, you know, that's funny. After we moved into the office and I took these pictures slowly, you know, through the next few years, I filled up my office with all kinds of stuff like you do. I never remember seeing those dolls again. So apparently they were part of the purge, but the llama was not. I guess whoever did the purge didn't know that the llama was Jem. And she was left, and I have her till this day. But isn't that a sad story that they would do that? I mean, how do you just eliminate a line of toys from your collective memory? It just was really sad. So my career proceeded apace. I moved into the Play School division, worked on Dolly Surprise and other projects, and then at the very end of 1989, I left Hasbro and went to Tonka, where I designed cupcake dolls and the hugely popular WWF Wrestling Buddies. And a couple of years later, Hasbro bought Tonka and they shut us down. And so I had just had a baby, so I decided to freelance for a while. Did some inventing. Invented that little doll on the bottom right, which was called Cuddle by Baby, and sold the concept to Fisher-Price, and then Fisher-Price hired me, so I went to work for Fisher-Price for a couple of years. And then in 1980, boy, I can't get my decades right, can I? In 1994, the end of 1994, Mattel bought Fisher-Price. So they transferred me back to Mattel. So 10 years later, I went back to Mattel for the second time and worked on Cabbage Patch Kids and Chatty Cathy, Polly Pocket, and then in 1997 I left Mattel and went out on my own for the next 12 years. Worked and I did a lot of work for Mattel, designed for Winnie the Pooh preschool, developed My Dream Baby for MGA. This was pre-Bratz. I mean, you can come and look at my book, which I will shamelessly plug. I freelanced for many years and just worked on some amazing projects. Worked on Holly Hobby, Strawberry Shortcake, Sky Dancers, lots of Cabbage Patch Kids, a little bit of My Little Pony, mostly girls products, which was awesome. And then the recession hit. In 2009, I went back to work and went to Spin Master in Los Angeles. Terrific company, worked on Liv dolls and Victoria's line of dolls. And then I was laid off kind of unexpectedly and took a few months break to freelance, coincidentally freelancing for Roseanne and Gina Beebe. By this point, they were product managing some things for Playmates toys for water babies, So I did a bunch of work for Roseanne, reconnected with her. That was, great experience. And then in 2012, I went to work for Toys R Us. And so my husband and I, who's in the back of the room, say hi, Bruce. Yay! By this time, all our kids were grown and out of the house, so we packed up our house, put everything in storage, and we drove to New Jersey, and I went to work for Toys R Us, which was a terrific experience. I worked in their, what they call our brands, their private label brands. So I designed for You and Me, Imaginarium, Just Like Home, Journey Girls, and did some wonderful stuff. This is just kind of the tail end. The dollhouse I did for Toys R Us, and the cute tree house, which is one of my favorite toys I've designed. I left Toys R Us in 2015 and went to work for about a year for Madame Alexander doll in New York, which was an interesting experience. I'll share that someday. But for now, I was there just about a year, and then I was laid off, and then we were a little bit adrift. So what do we do now? So I decided that it was time to start freelancing. I wasn't going to retire, but so we decided to leave New Jersey, and we moved to Utah, and that's where we are now. Our daughters live there, 3 of our grandkids live there, and I continue to do projects. I have been inventing, I have been developing, I'm still drawing, and then in addition to that, coming to JemCon 5 years ago has led me to doing all kinds of conventions. I do podcasts, I do a lot of social media, I do schools, career days, I teach in universities. These are some of the experiences that I've had, and I like to create cute art, so I continue to do a lot of drawing, everything from digital to analog. And then the last thing I threw in, you're going to be meeting Gina Malone, and she and I were colleagues together, so these are some old pictures. Gina came from RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. She'd been a puppet in the puppetry program. So the picture on the right, you see Gina with a little tie in her hair. And on the top of that picture is me with my poodle haircut, holding my son, Alec, who is now 38, and my daughter next to me, who's now 41, laughing at Gina's puppets. And then there's 2 other pictures of her. And then the one at the bottom left is Toy Fair 2020 with Gina and me, and in the middle is Kathy Azuzian, or Kat Demas, the one who did almost everything with Jem that Roseanne and I didn't do. So those are kind of the 3 musketeers back together again a few years ago. So that's the end of my presentation, but whatever time I've got left, I'd love to answer questions. You can turn the lights on. Yes, Sharon.
Hi, yeah. I've asked this before. Did you ever see any of the original Jem artwork? Just ideas and know what happened to it?
And I'm going to ask, in between, we're just going to repeat the question out loud so that Zoom can hear. So Sharon Natel wants to know.
Sharon wants to know what happened to the original artwork.
Did you see any of the original art?
I'm sure that I did, but so you're trying to track it down?
Well, no, it's really funny.
Curiosity.
There all these big things that I don't know if anybody knows what happened to it,
They did find it recently. Like 4 years ago, they just told Integrity was doing again the high-end dolls, and somebody from Hasbro told the marketing director, "Oh, by the way, we found this artwork," and they sent in like high-resolution scans from the originals.
So they have the originals.
Like 4 years ago, they probably still have, or maybe like you were saying yesterday, they're going to be part of the new purge.
Well,
so maybe there's still time.
I'm gonna do some investigation, Sharon. I'll try to find out. I'm very fortunate that I'm good friends with the new president of Hasbro. He's an old colleague. He's been around the business, and he's a really nice person, not a bureaucrat. So now that I found out that there has been some archiving, purging, I'm gonna see if we can't get to the bottom of it.
Who is the president?
His name is Tim Kilpin, not the CEO, is the president. So Tim is he's an Mattel, been at Mattel a couple times. We worked together at Tonka on the Wrestling Buddies, and he's just an awesome person.
Because
Very approachable.
That
Well, I'll talk to Tim, see if we can't get, kind of cut through, because Alan,
Yeah,
you
I'm
know,
surprised that I couldn't imagine that they just put it in a bin somewhere.
they might have, because that, don't get me started. But your artwork was so, you know, spectacular. I can't imagine any of that ever, you know, being just tossed aside. So I'm optimistic. My artwork, on the other hand, is probably all long gone. I hope not, but I wouldn't be surprised. So we'll see if we can find out, Sharon. Any other questions? Yes, Whitney.
At the risk of making a terrible pun, which has never stopped me before, you worked in synergy, if you will, on the synergy ball, and I guess in general, but pertaining specifically to Jen, did you find it challenging having to collaborate with different ideas, or was it something you thrived off of, or did it just depend on the project?
That's a really good question. So Whitney asks, was it challenging to be in a collaborative project rather than having projects your own? Not for me. I mean, when I was at Mattel, where I really got my start, for example, Popples was entirely collaborative. There was about 4 of us, maybe 5 designers, and we would get together and we'd have brainstorms, and I would sketch, and they would say, oh, we should have one pink ear and one blue ear, and so we'd color, you know, I mean, it was just highly collaborative, and I loved the energy off other people. But it is also nice to have projects that you have control over. So I think I really don't mind either way. I mean, ultimately, most designers would probably prefer to have every project be their own and have control, but there's no such thing as control in the toy industry, because there's always a layer above you that's going to cost reduce, make changes, engineers that are going to say that can't be done, we can't do that cost effectively, or some person that says, I just don't like that, you know, you're going to have to change it. So the ability to be flexible, to make changes, to turn on a dime, to, you know, start over again, to work with other people, really, I think is a skill that's kind of necessary. And you can't have thin skin, you know, you can't get too attached. When Moondreamers and Jem went away, we actually had like a wake for them. We built like a little casket. I was just so sad. But generally, you know, you kind of take it with a grain of salt, because that's how it is in, you know, that kind of industry. Their projects get shelved, and yet as I said before, we're never working on just one project. So if you were working on one thing and it got dropped, you might think, well, I might lose my job now. You know, if I were in animation and I were working on an animated film that got dropped, you might lose your job. But with toys, we were always working on multiple lines. So, you know, you just kind of redouble your efforts on the other line and get back to work. So, you know, I think that's a really good question. I think it's probably different for everybody, but for me, it was fine. I didn't have any problem. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yes, I did. It's more a design question. I was just curious what inspired you to mix certain colors, different fabric types and textures when you were kind of designing specifically these second line dolls.
You know, I think she asked about combining different fabric types and colors and textures together and how hard it was. You know, that's the magic of scissors and swatches. You know, you cut little pieces of fabric out. We would do, you know, inspiration boards where we would take, you know, tape and we'd stick things up together to see what looked, what matched, what worked. So I think it's just experience and experimentation. Just say, yeah, that particular metallic tricot fabric looks really terrific with that, you know, pearlized tricot or that print. It's just, I tend to not like to combine wovens and knit fabrics together. I like to kind of keep them along the same thing. But that was an interesting question, because that leads to the fabulous pants on Kimber. Now, Walter has 2 versions of the Kimber doll here. There's one that's kind of a sad color, and then there's one that's kind of a vivid green. The actual production color was somewhere in between. It was like kind of a chartreuse. And you see that there's wrinkles in the fabric. That was intentional. The fabric that I picked was wrinkled, and it was super cutting edge. It was like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest. It wasn't, you know, nubbled up in the hamper. It was actually wrinkly fabric, and I loved that fabric. And so and it is a woven fabric, but I wanted to use it. And so I think what would happen is the factories would get us, an amount of the fabric to work with, and when they would run out, they would have to go out into the open market in China or in Hong Kong and find fabrics that went, and sometimes they didn't match very well. But my favorite story was over in Europe, and I can't remember whether it was the French catalog, I think it was the French Hasbro catalog. The person who did the photo shoot, they took the pants and they pressed them. And there was a little pleat, and that's in my book, so if you have my book you can see. So when I saw it, I was like, what? But I guess they weren't as cutting edge as I was. It's only France, right? Haute couture. Okay, wait, one, yeah. Synergy.
At what point in your life did you decide that you wanted to be a toy designer? Did you know when you were a little girl playing with toys, or did you just stumble into the field?
About 5 minutes before I went to the job fair at Mattel. I started my career as an advertising illustrator and a children's illustrator. So I illustrated for children's magazines, and I was a storyboard and comp illustrator for a lot of advertising agencies in Los Angeles. And I had done a lot of children's work. I started illustrating for children's magazines, wanted to be a children's book illustrator, and kind of found that that path wasn't going to work for me. And since I was living in Southern California, one of my friends told me that Mattel was going to have a job fair. And I had a decent portfolio of children's art, so I took it to the job fair and they hired me. And it was, whoa, that was pretty surprising. And then when I went, when I was ready to start, they gave me a choice. They said, would you like to go into our packaging department and do packaging illustration and graphic design, or would you like to go into product design? And I mean, I was faced with this huge dilemma, because my background would have led me to go into package design, because I had done some package design before. I had done illustrations for toys, but I had never done a three-dimensional product before. But that sounded like so much more fun. So I said I'd like to be in product design, and when I walked through that door in January 1985, that was like a whole new world, and it was the best decision I could have made. It really was the right one.
I'm sorry, I could just ask you questions for hours. Knowing that you were, not to put it crassly, but under the thumb of the bean counters, if you will, and just, monetary constraints, my mind starts going, do you almost overcompensate in your product design, knowing that it would be pared down a little bit and secretly knowing where it would probably land in your designs?
Her question is, because we know that the bean counters and the cost people are going to want to reduce the cost dramatically of your product, do you compensate for that by giving them more, knowing that they're going to take stuff out? And the answer is yes. What I tried to do is I always looked at it, goes way back, so maybe the cars aren't the most, the best analogy. But I always say, they want the Cadillac version, you're going to get the Volkswagen version, so you give them the Chevrolet version. So you don't give them the Cadillac version, not because you don't want to wow them, but because you know that they're going to laugh at you. It's like, you think you're going to get all that? So, of course, you give them more than what you're going to get, but you never give them the pared down version, because that's not exciting enough. I mean, half the toys that come out, if the upper management knew how lame they were going to look, they never would have approved them in the first place. So, excellent question. Yes?
Just a perspective question. If you walk down the toy aisles of Target or Walmart today, what do you think about the toys you see there?
Oh boy. You're opening a can of worms. I know these ladies over here love all the new stuff. I have mixed feelings. I see stuff out there that I think is really exciting, and I see certain trends out there that just don't appeal to me aesthetically, but I understand them. But all in all, because I still design toys today, and I'm still working in the toy industry today, I have a perspective that goes back pretty far. Plus, I'm like old, and so I'm thinking about the toys I played with in the 50s and 60s, and my first Barbie and all that. I really do think that the 80s and 90s were the golden age of toys. And the amount of detail, the inventiveness, the stuff that we got to put in our toys that today we wouldn't be able to because of cost concerns and because of margin expectations and all of the marketing things. You know, the toy companies have not done themselves any favor because they failed to raise the retail price, or actually the manufacturer's list price, what we call the A price, high enough, because they figure parents will only pay X amount for this and only pay X amount. And that number has stayed static for many, many years. Or if they just raised them up, people would have paid a little bit more. And so they could have, instead of reducing the quality of the toy, they could have kept up and the toys would have been better for it. But, and you know, my understanding might be naive. I don't claim to be a, sales marketing guru on that, but just from what I can observe, I don't think you get as much for your money now because they're unable to put that in. Everything has gone up. All costs have gone up. Shipping costs have skyrocketed. It costs a mint to land a toy. And so, it's not really the manufacturer's fault, but if they had raised their prices along the way instead of kind of keeping them low, then it wouldn't hit consumers so hard, or they wouldn't be disappointed when they open the toy and find out that it's, not what they hoped it would be. Did that answer your question?
Very much so. Yeah.
Great. Yes, Stefan.
Was it your idea to change the colors and the material of the instruments of the holograms?
What about, you want to know?
If it was your idea to
Yes. So he wants to know if I changed the color of the instruments. Yes, and I got to I got to pick the finish on the toys, and of course designing that keyboard thing, that Synergy. That was one of my favorite projects, and choosing the colors and the image that went in, the little sticker that went in, and doing all the finishing touches. So yeah, and then the earrings. I designed the earrings, the new earrings, and picked the colors, and tried to coordinate everything.
We're at time, so I'm going to just say maybe one more question.
Okay, one more.
Oh.
Okay, right here.
Maybe two. Do we have two hands or one?
And then if you have more, you can come and ask them later. Yes.
So when you're inventing, so like there's I feel like there's style and there's function in a complete design, and so there's color change and flip, and like the cupcake dolls you did that have flipping, and so there's some of that is really problem solving to figure out how to get it to achieve this this effect that you're looking for. Could you tell us about that process, and if there was anything that you wanted to do that just physics didn't let you do?
Oh, that's a really good question. When you're prototyping dolls and you're putting them together, you really have to test a lot of things to make sure that they're going to function. Sometimes we have team people like a model shop or a model maker or a mechanisms builder that can help you, put together something so that you can test it. But ultimately, as designers, we kind of have to make sure that everything functions properly and experimental. So you were talking about the cupcakes. So this is just a little minor thing, but it was really fun to do. The cupcakes, each of the cupcake, you're familiar with cupcake dolls. How many of you? I have a couple of them on my table. You can come and take a look at them. But the little skirts, they didn't have legs. The little skirts were like cupcake wrappers, and they were made out of vinyl, and they had the little pleats like a cupcake wrapper. And it was a very soft vinyl. You could flip it up over the head, and then it hid the doll, blah, blah, blah. So when I came to Tonka, I was asked to do a more deluxe version. So I came up with the idea to do the Princess Parfait. And I wanted to have, because these were rotomolded, like a doll face, I wanted to have a pattern on one side when it was in its parfait form, and when you flipped it into the doll form, I wanted to have another pattern. So that was, I had to see if that could happen, because it had never been done. As far as I know, it hadn't been done, to have a rotomolded thing with two different patterns on each side. And so we tested it, and it kept tearing, and we finally got the right consistency, and it worked. And so it's fun, you know, being part of that development process is what I think is the fun part. When I was freelancing, I was doing a lot less of that because I was mostly doing artwork and concept exploration. It was mostly 2D. I wasn't building a lot of stuff, but working in-house at the toy companies was really fun to see if we could make these things work. And I think we're out of time, right?
I think so. Did I see one more question, or are we good? Then could we, oh, okay.
Sharon.
I did want to have one question. I looked at the dolls, and I actually it's too far. Because I was fascinated. Did you sculpt the dolls, or was that sent off to the sculpt, once you designed the dolls, that sent off to the doll sculptors?
So with Gem, all the sculpture was done without any input from me. I was designing, you know, we were doing the fashions, the faces, the hairstyles. I think Roseanne was directing all the sculpting for the dolls. So for
doll figures. So you had a department that just did doll figures and heads and things?
yes. There were, but we were, for example, we would have the doll heads rooted, but it was up to us to style the hair. So we were in there with our little dolls on a stick and our scissors, and really, you'd see our offices.
Fabrics too, because when I
Yes, draping fabric, pinning it on, and we did all that experimentation.
When I got the dolls, I got the prototypes, and then I had to go and find these fabrics. I was on the internet. It was nuts.
Yeah, you think it was hard to get fabric for the dolls. Think about going doll scale to human scale that Sharon had to do. Must have been really hard.
But finding the fabrics pre-internet was like...
Right, and you were in Boston, right?
No, I was in Rhode Island.
Oh, I thought you were in Boston.
No, it was right next to, I actually had done work for Hasbro, so I was in Providence.
Okay. Yeah, there wasn't a lot available in those days. Good job. You did just such a wonderful job.
It was fascinating when you talked about the fabrics. I said, oh.
You know about the fabric, yes, and actually finding fabric. Nowadays, you're more likely to see custom designed fabric prints for the dolls, but we didn't necessarily have as much technology back then to do that. Although I did do some pioneering fabric design back in the 80s, and it wasn't until like the 90s and 2000s that we had the technology to do that. But finding doll prints that are scaled that small for dolls that don't look like their grandma's quilt. You know, you want to find contemporary looking fabrics that are tiny that'll work for dolls is really hard.
Well, textiles, I think, is the most difficult part of it.
Right.
Yeah. That was interesting, but I hear what you have to say about that.
Well, thank you. Well, we both had a challenging job, didn't we?
It was.
Okay, I guess we're done with questions.
I believe we're done, although Stephanie will be around so you can speak with her privately, but could we give a big round of applause?